chapter 2. We finished. We're going to pick up in verse 64. But I want to remind everyone on this book of Ezra and what we're reading and the significance of it. God had promised Israel they would be in subjection to Babylon for 70 years. The 70 years is now over, and God is allowing the Jews to return. And this is a big deal because this was prophesied centuries before it ever happened. And we're seeing these prophecies come out in stark detail, these things that God had promised his people would come to pass after the 70-year bondage. And so we read through most all of chapter 2 last week, listing the people that came back and the count of them, and there were, which we will talk about here in a moment, but there were over 42,000 of the Jews that returned from Babylon to Judah. And you can see on the map here, I'll point out the trek from Babylon. It was about a 1,500-mile journey, and it took about 4 months. So it wasn't just that you got in the car and you were there in a few hours, obviously. This journey was a significant journey. I will remind you, too, that Cyrus, the king of Persia, gave these folks that wanted to return provisions to be able to make the journey back, and made a decree that the people that were returning, or that the people that they were going to encounter on the return would be friendly and accepting of these people that are going back to Judah. So this, again, this is a huge deal. And so as we read through this, keep that in mind. Now we're going to read in chapter 3 about the reestablishing of the altar and the foundation rebuilding of the temple, which we'll talk about in detail as we get through chapter 3. But in chapter 2, we're going to pick up here in verse 64. Last week we finished with the listing of all the people that returned. And here in chapter 2, beginning in verse 64, we're going to just kind of tie off some loose ends from that. And I'll have some comments, and then we'll start chapter 3. So chapter 2, beginning in verse 64. And I think the reading will begin. I messed with this today, and hopefully the reading begins in verse 64, but we'll see. You guys are adaptable.
Beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were
Nope, it stopped on 65.
And there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, their asses 6,720, and some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God, to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pound of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So the priests and the Levites, and some of the people and the singers, and the porters, and the Nethinims, dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities.
Now I worked to get that to start reading on verse 64, and it started on 65. 64 gives us the total of the people, 42,360, and then their servants, there in verse 65, is another 7,530 that are coming on this journey from Babylon back to Jerusalem. It lists there in verse 66, following the different animals that came. So they weren't traveling empty-handed, and many of these people have been living in Babylon for many years, and so they had their household that they were taking as well. And so a lot of these animals were part of their households, but some of these animals were given by Cyrus to these people for their journey, because they was going to have to eat along the way and that type of thing. So notice verse 68. Verse 68 here. When they got to Jerusalem, they went to the house of the Lord. Now understand, the house of the Lord had been destroyed. There wasn't anything there. But the place where that temple stood, they were still calling the house of the Lord, because that is where the temple had stood and where it is going to stand here in the next few years once they begin building it. But understand that this house of the Lord is essentially nothing but rubble at this particular point. But as we read in chapter 3, they're going to erect the altar and begin building the temple here on this place that they refer to as the house of the Lord. Notice there also in verse 68, they offered freely. So they're giving of these materials to begin to rebuild, which we're going to talk about this in depth in chapter 3. But here's what they gave in verse 69. 61,000 drams of gold. Now, I looked that up. 61,000 drams of gold is 3,812 ounces of gold, which I didn't convert that to pounds. I should have, but in today's prices, that is $15 million worth of gold. Now, gold is at an all-time high today, but that's a lot of money no matter what. And it says there they gave 5,000 pounds of silver, which I can't read my notes here. It's 38,000 ounces of silver, and that is, no, that's, where did I put that? That's 8,000 ounces of silver, and that's $3.8 million worth of silver that was given to begin to build the house of God. Now understand that the temple that Solomon built that was destroyed was not pure gold. It was made of wood, and it was overlaid with gold. So, all this stuff was burned up because it was wood with gold and silver overlays. So, and that's how they're going to begin to rebuild the second temple. But these items were given freely, just like the items when Moses' tabernacle was built. Those items were given freely. And just like the temple that Solomon built was given freely to build these houses for the Lord. And again, like I mentioned last week too, the things here at New Haven Baptist Church are supported by gifts that are freely and willingly given. There's no compulsion here to give. There's no pressure for you to give a certain amount. Everything that brings into this church is given freely and willingly, not by compulsion or threat. And that's the way it was here, at least what we read here in Ezra chapter 2. These things were given willingly. And again, I want to refer back to the tabernacle in Moses' day and the tabernacle of Solomon, the original temple. It says there in verse 70, the priests and the Levites, all these people, once they came to the house of God, they all went to their cities. Now, in Joshua chapter 13 through 22, that lists the inheritance of these tribes and where they received their cities and their land. And so after they originally come to Jerusalem, they now scatter throughout the land to their cities to begin to build their abodes. Again, the land is desolate. They're going there. They don't have homes. And so these folks are going to go and prepare their places to live, their abodes, their domiciles. And we will see here in chapter 3, they're going to come back to the temple area and begin that work there after they have went to where their cities are, according to Joshua 13 through 22, and rebuild their inheritance. Okay? Everybody okay with that? Comments or questions? All right. Let's go to chapter 3, maybe. Come on. Why is it doing this to me? Stop. No. No. So, and Cynthia's jumping ahead. That's fine. Keep in mind, all of the sacrifices and all the priestly duties that God had demanded to them had not been carried out for 70 years. But as we will see here momentarily, they kept the garments, which we see here in verse 70, but we also see that they kept the Levitical, the priesthood line, so that we know when we go back who the high priest is, which we'll talk about that in just a minute. But they had not been able to keep their practices because they weren't in their land. Now, I do believe that the devout Jews kept what they could and did what they could to honor the Lord. But as far as the requirements of taking a lamb or a sacrifice to the temple, that obviously has not been taking place. And so that is the first thing they do. We see, well, I'm jumping ahead here. More on that in a moment. But we do see when they first get to Jerusalem, they do go to the temple area. That's what we read there in verse 68 through 70. So that's the first thing they do is go to this temple area, and then they scatter. Now we're coming back here in chapter 3, and we'll begin to see some of this stuff take place.
Ezra 3. And when the 7th month was come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem.
So we see here,
Then stood up
stop. We see here that they are now coming back in this 7th month. Now, this 7th month is the 7th month since they left Babylon. But this is also this time of year in September and October. This would be the beginning of their new year, Rosh Hashanah, which just happened. Then they have Yom Kippur, which is right after Rosh Hashanah. And then there's another Feast of the Tabernacles, I believe. But all of these feasts take place beginning on this, where we are here, this verse 1 of chapter 3, in this 7th month. This is the new beginning for the Israelites, the Hebrews. So they are coming together at the temple site on this Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and they are going to begin the sacrifice work that had been taking place prior to their deportation. So we can't necessarily just look at this and say, well, okay, on the 7th month, this is significant in the fact that this is when we could say essentially the 70-year captivity stopped, because now they are doing what they are called to do, which was come daily and give sacrifices and to celebrate these festivals that God had ordained. But this is here in verse 1. They've come back from their cities to Jerusalem in order to begin these daily sacrifices. This is here in chapter 3, verse 1. Now, we got something else significant here in verse 2.
Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, and builded the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God.
So they've come together now. Joshua, which I'm going to talk about him in depth here in just a moment, and Zerubbabel, these are the two men, these are the leaders of this activity. But they rebuild the temple, or they rebuild the altar, and they offer up burnt offerings. Keep in mind, there's no temple, but they built the altar first, because the altar was the scene of the sacrifices. Yes, the altar happened in the temple, but the altar, or the sacrifices happened in the temple, but the sacrifices happened on the altar. And it's no different than here. If this church burns down, we could have church in the parking lot, could we not? It's not necessarily the building that represents New Hebron Baptist Church, it's the people. And in much the same way here, we see the altar is what represents the sacrifice of God, not the temple itself. Now, granted, the temple is very important. I don't want people to misunderstand that the temple building is not important, because it's a big deal. But notice, they built the altar first and began the sacrifices on that altar before they began to actually build or rebuild the temple. Now, Joshua is not the Joshua that we're familiar with in the book of Joshua. This is many centuries later. But this Joshua is the first high priest after the captivity. Now, I want us to turn. I'm jumping ahead here. Let me see here. I want us to turn to 2 Kings chapter 25. And also, I do want to apologize. I meant to start with this. I have inadvertently led you folks to believe that the temple was destroyed early on in the Babylonian captivity. But I'm incorrect. I don't think I've actually said it out loud, but I've implied that the temple had been destroyed for 70 years. The temple really wasn't destroyed until about 20 years into the captivity. The temple was destroyed in 585 BC, but the first captivity began in 605. So it had been 50 years since the temple had actually been destroyed. So the men that we're going to read about that remembered the first temple were not nearly as young as what I had led you to believe in prior lessons, okay? Because it had only been 50 years. So perhaps, the men that we're going to read about that saw the second temple were maybe could have been, 60, 70 years old instead of 80 or 90. All right? Everybody okay with that? No. The temple was, the temple would have been in Jerusalem, and they were in Babylon. Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to get that out. I meant to start with that. So here we are in 2 Kings chapter 25. This is where the temple is destroyed. So this would be 585 BC. And we read here beginning in verse 18. 2 Kings 25:18. And the captain of the guard took Sarai, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the door. And out of the city he took an officer that was set over the men of war, and 5 men of them that were in the king's presence, which were found in the city, and the principal scribe of the host, which mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land that were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, took these and brought them in unto the king of Babylon to Riblah. And the king of Babylon smote them and slew them at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was carried away out of their land. So this is the final destruction of the temple. But notice here in verse 18, the captain of the guard took Sarai, the chief priests. Go back now to Ezra chapter 3, verse 2. Sarai, the chief priest that got killed by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar in 585 BC, is the grandfather of Joshua here in Ezra chapter 3, verse 2. So when they come back to Jerusalem, Joshua here is the high priest. Apparently his father, Josadak, had died in captivity or somehow could not make it back to Jerusalem. But we see here Joshua is the high priest, which would have been the tradition or the God mandate that he be the high priest after his father and his grandfather. So we see here Joshua's grandfather died at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar when the temple was destroyed. I thought that was very interesting to see that this, I want to say tradition, but this mandate by God that the high priest be in this line, here we are 70 some years later, and the high priest is who it's supposed to be. Joshua. Yeah, right. Yeah, Jeshua. Yeah. Sorry, it's Joshua. That's what I've been pronouncing it, but the spelling does have an E in it there. But we see here in verse 2, they've built the altar and they're beginning the sacrifices. This is a high mark. Let me look here at other verses here. I've got verses down talking about the sacrifices. I'm not going to touch on that. Let's move on. Verse 3.
And they set the altar upon his bases, for fear was upon them because of the people of those countries. And they offered burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord, even burnt offerings morning and evening.
So, talking about the fear of the people, remember, yes, it was desolate, but there were people living in Canaan, because once the Jews left, people moved in. Moabites, Canaanites, Ammonites, these enemies, per se, have moved in and taken the land over. And so, now that we're here on this temple, we got to look around and make sure our enemies don't attack us while we're trying to rebuild the altar and the temple. And this is going to be a problem for them from this point forward. These enemies of God are wanting to disrupt the work, which we will see as this all unfolds here. But nevertheless, even though they've got this trouble outside that they got their eye on, they began offering the burnt offerings morning and evening, even in amongst the rubble, even in amongst the work that is going to begin. The burnt offerings daily, evening and morning, are going to begin and continue. This is a big deal for them. Verse 4.
They kept also the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number, according to the custom as the duty of every day required. And afterward offered the continual burnt offering, both of the new moons and of all the set feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and of every one that willingly offered a freewill offering unto the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month began they to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid.
So we see here, they're beginning to celebrate all of these festivals, all of these sacrifices that God had commanded Moses way back in the book of Numbers and Leviticus. These daily and monthly and random, I'll say, festivals, they are now beginning to keep. And again, we have Rosh Hashanah, what is in our modern day the term Yom Kippur, and the Festival of Trumpets and the Festival of Booths. They're beginning to celebrate these once again in their home. And notice what verse 6 says. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So they didn't wait to build the temple. They didn't wait to rebuild everything. They put up the altar, and they began their worship. Comments or questions? Okay. Oh.
So that altar, was that the original altar? Is that one of the things that they got back?
I don't remember there being the altar brought back, so that's a good question on what they would have used. And maybe the altar was left behind. I don't really know. Yeah. I don't know that it had to be specific to what was there prior. If it had have been, I think perhaps God would have told us that the altar was left behind. But all I know is that they rebuilt it. So perhaps that leads me to believe that it had been left behind. But that I don't know. I don't, because I don't remember reading. I'm looking here in chapter 1 where we read about these things that were brought back. Yeah, I don't remember the ark or the altar being brought back. So, good question. So I don't really know what altar, whether they completely rebuilt one was fresh, whether it was the old one that had been left behind. I do not know.
What were they offering up? 'Cause I don't see where they had sheep there.
Well, but if you look back there in chapter 2, verse 67, or 66 and 67, that is some of the things that they brought back, but it doesn't say actually sheep. That's a good question, too. No, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't say they brought back any sheep, but we would have to assume that whatever sacrifices they were giving were accepted by God, but maybe they just didn't count the sheep. Maybe they weren't that important. I don't know. Good question, Dan. Hey, you can ask all the questions y'all want, but I don't necessarily have the answer to it. There you go. And I can only prepare so well. I mean, there's just some things I'm not going to know. All right. Let me look at my notes here, which I don't normally do. Okay, I think we're good. All right, verse 7.
They gave money also unto the masons, and to the carpenters, and meat, and drink, and oil, unto them of Zidon, and to them of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea of Joppa, according to the grant that they had of Cyrus king of Persia. Now in the 2nd year of their coming unto the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, began Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua the son of Jozadak, and the remnant of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all they that were come out of the captivity unto Jerusalem, and appointed the Levites, from 20 years old and upward, to set forward the work of the house of the Lord.
All right, so we see here in verse 7, money was given to masons and carpenters, meat and drink. So the people doing the actual work were being taken care of by the people. Again, much like we support a pastor in our church today, we support him with a a salary. Now, back here, we're saying that they had a salary, but they were also getting fed. So perhaps we need to start giving Lee and Hillary and Owen beans and cornbread.
Can we afford that?
Well, that's what I said, beans and cornbread. That's cheap. And if we get lucky, maybe we'll give them a ham. But we see here that the people doing the actual work were going to be supported by the people that were going to be benefiting by having the temple rebuilt. It says here that they went to Zidon and Tyre and began to get cedar trees, which is what Solomon did when he built the first temple. He got cedar trees from Lebanon, from Hiram, which was the king of Tyre and Zidon then. And so the same system that was used in the first temple is now being used in the second one to bring the cedar trees from Lebanon down the Mediterranean coast to Joppa and then land across the land to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple here. And again, according to the grant that they had of Cyrus, king of Persia. So they had a command from the king that these folks were to help in assisting the Jews in rebuilding their temple. All right? This was a command by Cyrus that this all happened. Now, we see here in verse 8, in the second year they've come together, and we got Zerubbabel and Jeshua here, and it says here that the Levites that are 20 years old and over are set forward. They're the ones put in charge to oversee the work of the rebuilding of the temple. Please understand, the altar work is still continuing. It goes on day and night, or morning and evening, I'll say. So that's still going on. They didn't set that aside to rebuild the temple because the temple is going to take many years to rebuild. But they've put these men in charge of the overseeing and the charge of the rebuilding of the temple. These Levites that are 20 years old and upward. Okay? And again, Joshua and Zerubbabel being the two main foremen, I suppose you could say, superintendents over the work. Verse 9.
Then stood Jeshua with his sons and his brethren, Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah together, to set forward the workmen in the house of God, the sons of Henadad, with their sons and their brethren the Levites. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together by course, in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth for ever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid.
Now, I will be honest in saying here, I don't know if this is the cornerstone of the foundation, whether this foundation was fully laid. I honestly, at this point today, I don't know. I haven't studied any further to see. But I'm going to just assume that this is the cornerstone that is set. And now, regardless of whether it's the cornerstone or the entire foundation, we have now a celebration. Look at what we've done. We have accomplished in setting this foundation for the rebuilding of the temple. This is the big first step in rebuilding. It's not any different than we build a building today. We celebrate in some form or fashion when the foundation is laid. Because you know what? Now we can finally begin to build. Now, you could say you start to build when you turn over the first spade of dirt. But I think we all understand the significance of having a foundation laid or a cornerstone laid in order to begin the building that we are setting forth to build. So we have a party, so to speak, or a celebration. And it says there, when the builders laid the foundation in verse 10, they set the priests in their apparels with trumpets and praised the Lord after the ordinance of King David. So they're following in the tradition of David and giving praise and honor to God. They sang together in chorus and they praising and giving thanks. Why? Because he is good and his mercy endures forever toward Israel. All the people shouted, verse 11, with a great shout when they praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. This is a big deal for these folks. A big deal. The foundation of the temple has been laid. This is a marker in their history. Notice verse 12, though.
But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy.
So we see the older people that had saw the first temple began to weep. Now, there's varying opinions as to the weeping. Some think that these older people are weeping because this is nothing like what the first temple was. This is so disappointing. But I look at it as I believe they were weeping because of the significance of the moment, the rebuilding of the temple, the reestablishment of the Jewish nation, and the reestablishment of Canaan as their homeland. Now, perhaps in some way they were sad that this temple is not going to be nearly as extravagant as Solomon's temple. But I just, the more I studied this, the more I thought, I think the weeping perhaps was joy in what it signified. And not necessarily weeping that, well, boy, this isn't nearly as nice as what Solomon's was. But perhaps they could understand, too, that Israel's not going to be what it was under David and Solomon. We've sinned, and we're just not going to be. Again, there's varying opinions as to the weeping, but that's my take on it. It says they wept with a loud voice, but many shouted for joy. Hey, whichever. It's a big deal. Now, we were reading the book of Haggai. When the temple's done, there's going to be people weeping. And again, some people believe that they're weeping because it's not nearly as extravagant as Solomon's temple. Nevertheless, we'll talk about that in a year or two when we're in the book of Haggai. See, I've got all this planned out, Anyway. But many wept. Verse 13.
So that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off.
So regardless of the emotion that couldn't be discerned, the noise of the people rejoicing and weeping was heard. It says there from afar off. How far, I don't know, but obviously far enough that you could be a distance away and still hear the celebration, the shouts of joy, the songs, the music, the worship, even amongst those ones that were weeping, perhaps because they were disappointed, but perhaps because they realized the significance of this. So anyway, that's where we're going to quit today. Oh, yeah.